Hi everybody! This will be the video that recaps all of the books that I read in May 2023. I had some really good reading this month, so I'm excited to talk about those books. First, we're going to kick it off with a book that I definitely enjoyed, and that is If We Were Villains by M.L. Rio. I feel like I've been meaning to read this one for years now, and I finally ended up just bringing it along with me to my trip to the Bahamas and reading it on the beach, which seems a little bit out of character considering this is like dark academia and it's got a murder in it. But, you know, it was a good choice because I ended up finishing the book on the beach because I just could not put it down. It was absolutely to my taste. The tragedy of this story mirrors a lot of the tragedies that Shakespeare has written, which I thought was really interesting given that the characters are all Shakespearean theater people in it. I liked the way that it was woven into the tale, and the structure of the story as well felt very smart to me. I didn't always love the characters, but I did find them to be compelling to read about. Their personalities really stood out in my mind, and I was vividly interested in seeing how their lives would intersect, the various events that would lead up to the big incident that this entire book is centered about. And I think M.L. Rio did a bang-up job telling this story, and I can see why it's earned such a unique place in the modern canon. The next two books that I read were part of the, I want to say, Book of Tea duology, and those books are A Magic Steeped in Poison and A Venom Dark and Sweet, both of which were by Judy I. Lin. And I have actually read this one. It was a reread for me, and it still felt the same way as when I read it last year. I loved that I read the first few lines and was immediately swept away and swept up into this story. I really enjoyed the magical lore of this story as much as I did the first time. Not only do we get some legends and some history, but we also have sort of magic centered around the tea ceremonies, from the ingredients to brewing the tea and to sort of the person who performs the tea ceremony. I quite enjoyed the tournament style setup of this story. That has always been something that appeals to me in books, and it worked very well here. But I actually felt a little more strongly about the political sort of power plays going on in the background of the court intrigue. I do still wish that I had felt more strongly for the main character cast, but it didn't really matter at this point because I was really in it for the story. And I thought that what Judy I. Lin does in A Venom Dark and Sweet, where she kind of fleshes out even more about the world and the lore and the politics, it was really cool. Like, it was just nice to jump back into this world so directly after reading the first one, and I love the new fantastical elements. I love that the scope of the world gets rather large, the stakes get even higher, the consequences even dire, and the relationships feel more poignant on all fronts, and I ultimately felt like she wrapped up the series on a very strong note, so I can highly recommend checking out this duology. The next book that I completed is a standalone. It is one that I have seen a lot of praise for, and that's The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. I've been curious about it for ages, and I honestly kind of anticipated loving it as much as I did. It was a really enjoyable book for me. The story is pretty simple and has a contained setting, but I was really delighted by and interested in the world and the lore and the characters. My particular favorite thing about this book was the fight scenes. They felt straight out of an anime, and I think that M.L. Wong executed them very well in a way that I thought was super enjoyable. I could guess at some of where the plot was going and could kind of see how the character relationships would play out, but I did enjoy it when it would like go into directions that I wasn't necessarily anticipating. I also was surprised that it got me quite emotional at some parts, and I could just feel so strongly on behalf of these characters in the story, and that's always a plus mark in my book. The next book I read also elicited some strong feelings, and they were more complicated than anything else, and that's the book Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. I still don't know how to articulate my feelings about Yellowface just yet, which is the same way I felt about Babel when I read it last month, but this is one of those books where it feels really discussable, but it also feels like it's very rooted in current modern day. There's integration of Twitter here. There is a lot of commentary on publishing as it currently is. What I have to say that I find the most clever about it is that Kuang has chosen to tell the story from the point of view of Juniper Song, of June's point of view, who is a white woman who ends up publishing work under a racially ambiguous name. It's a work that she's actually stolen from her dead colleague, or, you know, and is justifying. And it just sets up everything in a very complicated way in an attempt to sort of explore the publishing industry, the standards of that, the racially charged parts of it. And I found that all very interesting and discussable. I also read this with my cousin again, which meant that I had someone to talk to while I was reading it, which was a good thing. I read really quickly too. It's a short book. Overall, I can't say that this is an R.F. Kuang book that I would like 5-star love. I do think it's interesting and I can see why a lot of people have been devouring it, but personally for me, I still preferred Babel. And then I read another Olivia Blake book, and that is Masters of Death. Across the board, I think Olivia Blake is just an author whose work I'm always going to be interested in reading. I think that she has such intriguing concepts, and she definitely is able to reel me in from the start of her books all the way until the end. I was a little confused at the start of this one as to where it was actually going to go, but once things start falling into place and the pace picked up, I felt like I was getting really drawn in. I liked how it came together, even though I do think there were parts of it that felt a little bit on the nose in terms of the theme, but overall it was a very interesting read. It's actually one that I would consider rereading again, just because now that I know what the story structure is, I feel like I'm gonna get more from it. I also completed another series this month, and that is the Kingdom of Cards duology. So that's Where Dreams Descend and When Night Breaks by Janella Angeles. And I reread this one and read this one for the first time. This one still holds up for me. There's something magical and whimsical and mysterious, and the characters in this one feel very real and alive, and the dynamics between them also feel very nuanced, and I quite enjoyed revisiting that, especially given that I listened to it on audio this time. And then I finally finished out the duology. I really had no expectations going into this one, just the hope that I would enjoy it as much as Where Dreams Descend. Unfortunately, that was not the case, but I do think it was written well and that it wraps up Kalia's story on a pretty solid note. So I feel like in this one we do get a lot of answers to the questions that we're left with at the end of the first, but we are also transported to a new setting and a new world that kind of feels jarring, and it gives us new rules and new characters to sort of get to know. I actually missed the more whimsical vibe of the first book. This one's a bit darker and heavier in tone. I also missed like the push and pull, will they, won't they dynamic. There's something completely different going on in this one, and it feels like Kalia is on a different sort of journey now. There's enough action and spectacle to keep readers hooked up until the end, especially at the end actually. The overall tone though is definitely different from the first book. It's a bit more melancholy, it's a bit more reflective, and I kind of feel that that lines up with the character journeys in the world that Angeles has set up in the first. It's not necessarily my favorite thing, as I prefer, again, the atmosphere of the first, but it kind of makes sense. Thematically, I do find a lot of this very interesting though, because there's perception and choice, illusion and reality, light and dark. It definitely coalesced into something that was interesting enough to keep on going, and I'm glad I finally finished the series. The next book I read was Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami. I picked this one up on a whim because I owned it for years and it's one of my shorter books, and I honestly had no idea what to expect from it. This is a brief sort of vignette style story that talks about main character Tsukiko, who in her 30s, she ends up meeting her old high school teacher, and then it kind of sort of tells you the story of their lives and how their relationship flourishes over a series of chosen memories that the author chose to share. I could see why this would work for some people and why it wouldn't work for others. It's a very slice of life story, but since you only get snippets of it, you're not really seeing the whole relationship develop between Tsukiko and her sensei. For me, I was intrigued to just keep on going up until the end, and I didn't necessarily love it, although there were some portions that I found cute or sweet. The writing and the translation, however, felt really smooth, and I think that would encourage me to pick up another work from this author. And then I read World of Wonders in Praise of Fireflies, Whale Sharks, and Other Astonishments. I've had this book since the year it came out and finally just got around to reading it. I overall have positive feelings about it. It's a collection of essays by this author that are part scientific knowledge about different parts of the natural world, but it's also part nostalgic storytelling as she shares some of her history growing up, raising her own family, so on and so forth. I like that she expressed some very relatable sentiments and some thoughtful musings here and there, and I didn't necessarily feel as deeply connected to or strongly about the different essays in this book, but they were well written, they were enjoyable, it was a quick diversion, and it was a good one to accompany me on my daily commutes. The next book I'm going to talk about, I've actually mentioned on the channel already. It was my biggest disappointment so far for 2023, and that is Immortal Longings by Chloe Gong. I've been anticipating this one ever since Chloe revealed that she was releasing an adult novel and that it was inspired by Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, which I'm admittedly not that familiar with. I've already talked a little bit about why this fell short of what I was expecting. Don't get me wrong, I still enjoyed it. I have a feeling that no matter what Chloe writes, I'm probably going to enjoy it just because I get get along very well with her writing style. But this one, I felt like there was a lack of development in the characters. I didn't feel very strongly about Kala or Anton, and I felt like there was something keeping me separated from them. And I also didn't end up feeling very strongly about the secondary characters either. And that being said, because I didn't feel very strongly about the characters, I also didn't feel very keen on their romance. Like, I still enjoyed the moments because I'm a sucker for certain kinds of scenes and certain kinds of commentary, but it just didn't feel very earned to me at this point. I also felt like the plot and the setting were very reminiscent of other stories that I've encountered. I would have liked a little bit more of the tournament structure, and I would have liked to feel more strongly about the world and the politics, although that maybe that'll open up in the second book. I honestly don't know. I'm just hoping that the potential I see in this first one is going to get developed on in the second book, so I'm still holding out hope for that. I then read There's No Such Thing as an Easy Job by Kikuko Tsumura. I was intrigued by the premise of this, especially given that I have had very strong feelings about work myself over the years. It's a slice of life story. It follows a main character who is exploring 5 different job options, what she learns about herself and the kind of work she wants to do while at these 5 different job postings. And I just like the fact that they all gave her some perspective on her own life and what she wanted to do for the rest of it. I think that was the part that really stood out to me about this one. I then read a collection of short stories, Never Have I Ever by Isabel Yap. This is a mixed bag for me. There were stories that I liked, there were stories I thought were just okay. What I do love is that it provides a modern take on a lot of Filipino lore and superstition that I've personally grown up with. It's also set in a variety of locations, which I thought added something interesting to it. Even though I enjoyed this one overall, I wouldn't necessarily say that any of the stories really ended up standing out to me or being very significantly memorable in the end. I also read a book for book club called Creativity Inc. Overcoming the Unseen Forces That Stand in the Way of True Inspiration, which is by Ed Catmull and Amy Wallace. This one I found to be a very interesting look into how Pixar as a company, specifically with regards to their management team, they protect the creative and collaborative aspects of their work. It was a little slow to begin with because it covers a lot of the basic history of Pixar and how it came to be, especially when it comes to the guy in charge. But I overall eventually found it cool to start learning about how Pixar operates behind the scenes once the company was up and running. I loved seeing the stories of the trials and the triumphs that the company has faced, but the main takeaway that I had from it was sort of how to nurture and maintain creativity. I felt that there were a lot of moments that hit really hard for me and some advice that I feel like could be applicable to my own creative endeavors, and in the end I think that's what really made it worth it for me to read the book. And last but certainly not least, I finished another duology, and that is Skyhunter by Maria Lu. So we have Skyhunter and Steel Striker. I have read a lot of Maria Lu books, and I said this about the first one, but it contains a lot of her signature style, which is a well-crafted plot that's paced with plenty of action, some interesting characters, and a complicated world situation for them. I enjoyed diving back into this story and seeing the setup for everything. I didn't love it nearly as much as the first time I'd read it, but that's kind of because I knew it was coming. It still very much kept my attention till the end, and then I was reminded of why I was so curious to continue the series in the first place. So I was glad to have finally read Steel Striker. Unfortunately, I preferred Skyhunter to this one. I do think we get to a very solid ending for the series here, but the pacing was a little bit uneven here. It gets a little dark, which kind of makes sense for the world, obviously, and for the themes. And there were times when I just found my attention drifting more than it had in the first book. At the end of the day, like, I was still interested in seeing how Talon's story would wrap up and if she and her companions were going to be able to find a way through or out of the predicament that they had been in, and overall it was a solid ending. Those are all the books that I read in May. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on them, and if you have any of your own, definitely leave them in the comments, and I will see you guys in a new video soon. Bye!